In view of the state into which the railways of Britain had fallen in the decades since the end of the Second World War, there can have been few citizens who were surprised by the announcement by the British Transport Commission that it had drawn up a plan to modernise British Railways to enable it to rise once again to a position of preeminence amongst the nation's transport operators. There was just the small matter of obtaining the sum of £1.2 billion from the Conservative government, which hadn't shown itself to be particularly well disposed towards the railways, it having shown a preference for road transport. Not only the government but the general public had a somewhat jaundiced view of the railways, which recorded their first operating deficit in 1955, the year in which the Modernisation plan was announced. Nationalised in 1948, the British Transport Commission's Railway Executive, better known as British Railways, had tried in vain to restore the position the railways had enjoyed before the war. British Railways was still dependent on the classic steam locomotive for the majority of its trains, other than on rural branches and cross-country routes, which were benefiting from diesel railcars which had been ordered before the modernisation plan was launched. 6 prototype mainline diesels were still regarded as under test. Steam locomotive development had reached its peak shortly before the war, epitomised by Sir Nigel Gresley's classic Class A4 Streamline Pacifics, one of which Mallard had captured the world's speed record for steam traction in 1938 with a speed of 126 miles an hour. Such a speed was unthinkable on the railway of 1955, although by then the arrears of maintenance from the war years had at last been eliminated. The A4s still represented the top flight of mainline steam on the East Coast Main Line, although the London and North Eastern Railway had produced a more powerful Express Pacific type at the end of its existence. These were the peppercorn Class A1s, the first of which actually appeared after the LNER had ceased to exist in 1948. British Railways Locomotive Committee saw that the future lay in the electrification of the railways as soon as possible, but a lack of investment capital following the country's economic crises after the war had meant that they had reluctantly decided that steam locomotive construction would still be needed until electrification could begin. The Modernisation Plan of 1955 also envisaged more electrification, but its principal pronouncement on locomotive affairs was that the interim power until full electrification should be diesel traction rather than steam. There can have been few railway enthusiasts who didn't shed a tear when they realised that Miles Beaver, named for one of the LNER's directors, and its fellow A4s were no longer going to be the top locomotives. They were the exception. The general public were fed up with the dirt and image of the steam railway, which King's Cross, seen here, epitomised. They saw the modernisation plan as the way to clean up the railways and bring them into the second half of the 20th century. It would mean the scrapping of nearly 20,000 steam locomotives, a process which was expected to last another quarter of a century or more, the normal economic life of a steam locomotive. No more would be ordered, and then current orders for 162 were cancelled. A further 33 from earlier orders would be cancelled later, leaving a rump of freight engines to be built as the last British Railways steam locomotives of all. The mainline electrification programme would initially be concentrated on the West Coast Main Line, the intention being then to move on to the East Coast Main Line from London to Edinburgh, where we see another A4 arriving with the Talisman, a new afternoon express for the East Coast Main Line introduced on the 17th of September 1956. It still boasted steam power, and the 20-year-old A4s were its normal locomotives. Limited development of steam was still allowed to continue, the A4s all receiving improvements to their exhausts, evidenced by double chimneys. At the same time, British Railways changed its coaching stock liveries, the previous blood and custard giving way to a deeper all-over maroon paint finish. A symbol of the new railway was a revised heraldic device for British Railways, applied in a roundel form to coaches of express trains and in a slightly different form to locomotives. As seen here on the clean black Edinburgh pilot locomotive, this ferret and dartboard replaced the previous cycling lion, seen on number 68477, as we run into Waverley. 1956 was to be a watershed year for British Railways. The previous year had seen it plunge into a working deficit for the first time. It lost £17 million, which is about £250 million today. And this year it would get even worse. The Modernisation Plan had been approved by the Conservative government, even to the extent of increasing the total capital requirement to £1.5 billion. That's around £15 billion today. The first orders for the new pilot scheme diesel locomotives had been placed, and the new trains and liveries gave the impression something was being done at last. The regions, which had effectively replaced the Big Four, LMS, LNER, Great Western and Southern Railways, were given back some degree of autonomy, although funding was still from central government. And herein lay the biggest problem resulting from nationalisation. Each of the Big Four had been responsible, as independent companies, for raising its own capital and thus directing its own investment. Now the Modernisation Plan directed as to where funds should be spent. Curiously, the old LNER empire had been split into three regions, roughly similar to the three companies which had worked together so well before the 1923 grouping had created the LNER. The southern portion was the eastern region, whose principal component was the Great Northern. The northeastern region was effectively the North Eastern Railway reborn, whilst the lines north of the border were put in the Scottish region. The latter also included the Scottish lines of the LMS, but that company's English lines remained together as the London Midland region. It was by far the largest part of the British Railways Empire, and now it would receive the lion's share of the Modernisation Plan funding. As another A4 heads for Aberdeen, it's worth noting that the intentions of the architects of the Modernisation Plan were honourable and appeared achievable. The plan stated, for reasons which are too well known to require repetition here, British Railways today are not working at full efficiency. This plan aims to produce a thoroughly modern system, able fully to meet both current traffic requirements and those of the foreseeable future. The electrification programme was intended to be a rolling one, with East Coast Main Line wiring to follow on directly from the West Coast one. Had the railways remained independent, these two schemes would probably have been advanced in parallel. The East Coast Main Line would suffer greatly from this ordering of priorities. Half of the Modernisation Plan funding would be swallowed up simply from the need to maintain current assets. The West Coast electrification would take over 10 years simply to reach from London to Manchester and Liverpool. It wouldn't reach Scotland until 1974. The only eastern side electrification to be funded under the plan was for suburban services around London. These would later be cut back to those emanating from Liverpool Street only. The Great Northern Suburban Line's electrification from King's Cross would be rescinded. Here we're passing Haymarket on the Edinburgh to Glasgow Main Line, for which no plans have ever been put forward for electrification. The only modernisation for this route was the introduction of diesel railcars in 1956, as we saw earlier in our story. In Scotland, electrification was proposed only for the Glasgow suburban system. The Scottish region was seen as a special case within British Railways. Although it had main lines from England by both the West Coast and East Coast routes, its internal lines were considered to be far less commercial than other parts of the system. There were some very lengthy lines serving low-density populations, such as the Highland Main Line to Inverness and the long straggling routes to the West Highlands at Oban and Fort William. The most northerly lines served the isolated communities of Wick and Thurso, and another long line gave the Isle of Skye a connection to the mainland by means of a railway to the Kyle of Lochalsh. These were all to be equipped with new diesels under the Modernisation Plan. The famous main line to Aberdeen across the massive Forth Bridge would also remain unwired. Perhaps the bridge itself summed up the problems facing the railway system. It required constant attention. The phrase "like painting the Forth Bridge" had long been a synonym for a job that could never be completed. No sooner had the painters finished painting the bridge from end to end, a process which would take many years, than it would be necessary to start again at the other end. The expenditure had little commercial return, but without it there could be no railway in the long term. This also illustrates the railway's situation vis-à-vis road transport. The railways have to provide the total infrastructure from trackbed to bridge to station to rolling stock. A road vehicle operator pays a tax to provide all but the vehicle itself. The state provides the infrastructure, and the road haulier doesn't have to give any thought to anything bar maintenance and fuel. The road vehicle can go anywhere, sometimes even where there is no road. Freed up from the constraints of the C licence system in 1954, the following year road transport carried more freight than the railways for the first time. Although the A4 still headed most of its expresses, the East Coast Main Line remained at the forefront of the railway thanks to the tenacity of its management and the cooperation of the various regional planning departments in a way that echoed the Great Northern, North Eastern and North British Railways half a century before. They were fortunate in having the solid base of the Gresley Pacific Fleet to keep the expresses running, even whilst other routes were experiencing the birth pangs of the new diesel fleets, and the inspired leadership of one of the unsung heroes of the British Railways era in Gerald Fiennes, the Eastern Region General Manager. The result was an order for 22 production Deltic diesels, to whose story we'll return, but it spelt the death knell for the Pacifics such as Gainsborough, seen on the northeast coast. Like the eastern lines, the western region was to go its own way on dieselisation. Unlike the eastern, the western was never even considered suitable for any electrification at all. The fierce independence inherited from the old Great Western was to see a rearguard action that caused British Railways to continue building the distinctive Great Western design pannier steam tank engines until as late as October 1956. The very last ones were a batch of 10 similar to number 8481, which is seen working on empty passenger stock duties at Paddington Station. They would have working lives of less than 10 years. Everything about the Great Western seemed unchanging in the early years of nationalisation. Castles still headed most expresses, and British Railways had even built some of them as well, to what was essentially a 40-year-old design. But things were about to change.
A demonstration run from London to Bristol. He's at the controls of British Railways' new 2,000 horsepower diesel hydraulic loco. A special coach next to the engine was used on this trip to demonstrate and record speed and performance. The plan is the replacement of steam by diesel traction on the western region, giving greater economy, cleanliness and speed.
The western region was to go its own way under the Modernisation Plan of 1955 and order diesels which were unique to it. Above all, they differed in their transmission, which was a hydraulic torque converter. The first 11 of these diesel hydraulics were built as part of the pilot scheme programme set out in the Modernisation Plan. The Western was authorised to build 5 of 2,000 horsepower, as seen here, and 6 of 1,000 horsepower, all to be equipped with German MAN engines and Voith transmissions, and built by the North British Locomotive Company, which held the licences. On another front, the Western also went its own way by reminding the world that it was the first to 100 miles an hour.
Here's what she did with primitive power, City of Truro 440, over 100 miles an hour, over 50 years ago. Yes, a wonderful old loco, the first vehicle in the world to do over 100. Now this museum piece has been brought out to haul specials for fans.
The pilot scheme envisaged a total of 161 diesel locomotives for evaluation before mass production could start. They were of 3 basic types, divided according to horsepower. This is a later production version of one of the more successful ones, a Type B, later Type 2, built by Brush Traction. The new developments were showcased by the British Transport Commission in a series of exhibitions.
British Railways plan to make their service the best in the world, and Transport Commission Chief Sir Brian Robertson opens an exhibition to show how it's to be done. Sir Philip Water, Southern Region Chairman, inspects a new diesel-driven coach which is already in production. Also interested is LCC Deputy Chairman, Mrs. Thornton. Diesel power is much in evidence. Here's the 3,300 horsepower diesel-electric locomotive, Deltic, and another of 1,000 horsepower. Transport Minister Harold Watkinson accompanies Sir Brian into a prototype first-class coach, which is the last word in travelling comfort. No need to hunt for a seat facing the engine, you turn it whichever way you want. And here's an ultra-modern adaptation of something to be found in every Victorian home, the Venetian blind. Comfortable, sir? One day, all British Railways coaches will be as luxurious as this.
The new coaches were a series of experimental coaches produced in 1956 to test out certain ideas with a view to incorporating them into the Mark I passenger coaches that were now in general use. The prototypes were placed in service, but few of their innovations were to be taken up. The modernisation plan didn't envisage much in the way of changes to this very successful carriage type, merely the acceleration of its introduction. However, on other parts of the railway, massive changes were afoot.
Before long, railways will only carry coal to industrial areas, not burn it themselves. It's less wasteful to use oil on railways for the time being, till the day when nuclear-generated electricity helps the main lines to be electrified. Meanwhile, the diesel holds the fort. At Paddington, the first diesel hydraulic locomotive built in British Railways' own workshops was named after the chairman of British Transport Commission. The general manager of the Western Region, Mr. K.W.C. Grand, was in charge of the ceremony. Sir Brian Robertson, as head of British Railways, is at the helm of the vast modernisation programme.
The locomotive named after the chairman was the Western Region's own version of a diesel hydraulic. 3 months after the pilot scheme authorisation for the North British locomotives, Swindon secured permission to build 3 more prototypes. These were far more radical than the North British ones. Pilot scheme locomotives and stock continued to be exhibited.
In other spheres too, the accent has been on experimentation and thinking to the future. British trains, for example, with their proud history, are today setting new standards in comfort and performance. At this exhibition at Battersea, London, we take a look at some of the first results of the £1,200 million modernisation and re-equipment plan for the railways, like this 3,300 horsepower diesel-electric prototype, most powerful yet built in this country. Locomotives like the Deltic, with its classical lines and tremendous efficiency, it has a maximum service speed of 90 miles an hour, are undoubtedly more than worthy to follow in the great tradition of the giants of steam that have always captured the imagination of boys from 8 to 80. Less attractive perhaps than the Deltic, but more versatile, is this 1,000 horsepower locomotive, the first mainline diesel-electric to be delivered under the plan. Among the prototype passenger vehicles on view, showing what the trains of tomorrow will be like and built to test public reaction under service conditions, is this attractive first-class carriage with the emphasis on comfort. Note the individually adjustable seats. Another carriage of a different design, this time second class, features more legroom by having 6 seats fewer than in those now in service. These carriages are also equipped with a special powder room for the ladies. The kitchen buffet car, already in service and the basis for this type of car built in the future, is designed to operate with adjoining saloons on services where there is a demand for meals and light refreshments, but which do not need the use of a full kitchen car. Apart from that, it looks nice. Another service that has already been tested successfully is the restaurant buffet car, a self-contained unit with a saloon seating 23 passengers and a buffet. Amenities like these will undoubtedly help realize this great plan to make British Railways the best in the world.
Scorfield Pike, driven from a comfortable cabin that gives little hint of its 2,300 horsepower, was on view at Marylebone Station. It's the most powerful mainline diesel-electric loco to be erected in British Railways' own workshops. 147 more will be running by 1961. Maximum speed will be 90 miles an hour. It's another nail in the coffin of the fine old steam locomotives, whose fatal fault is that they burn too much coal. So oil takes over, as elsewhere on the British system, lines are being electrified. Railway modernisation makes fine headway.
D1, despite its number, was the last of the pilot scheme types to enter service. The pilot scheme was a good plan, even though some of the locomotives built under it were failures, but that was the whole point of it. 10 English electric baby Deltics were a complete disaster, whilst most of the North British machines were extremely unreliable. Also a poor buy were the British Thomson Houston or Clayton Type 1s. Not that you would realise it after this build-up.
May we introduce locomotive number D8200, an 800 horsepower diesel-electric for mainline use. It's the first of its type, and it aroused great interest at Euston when it was handed over to the British Transport Commission. It's also a notable occasion for us, the travelling public, because this loco is part of an impressive plan for faster, more punctual trains. We've got an interest in it, of course, because this nationalised industry is spending £1,200 million of our money on streamlining rail services.
It wasn't the pilot scheme which was a failure, but the panic orders which followed. For example, another type of Class 1 locomotive, this time with a centre cab, was ordered straight off the drawing board from Clayton's as an intended standard class of diesel. They were even worse than the prototypes. 117 were built, the earliest giving such trouble that later built ones went straight into store on delivery whilst the problems were being investigated. This was a catastrophe arising from a crisis. In 1957 the pilot scheme was abandoned and massive orders were placed for new and untried locomotives, a theme to which we'll return later. Other aspects of the modernisation scheme affected most parts of the railway. Level crossings had always been an expensive and inconvenient problem. Every set needed attention by signalling staff or level crossing keepers, and staff were expensive. The plan foresaw all crossing gates being replaced by lifting barriers such as seen here. They would still be attended by signalmen, but remotely from a signalling centre. It's been said that level crossings are the one place where the railway has always had dominion over the car, but in the 1950s road traffic was growing rapidly, and level crossings, with their attendant hold-ups, were yet another reason why the general public had fallen out of love with the railways. The flagship policy of the modernisation plan was the electrification of a number of railway routes. The most important was that of the West Coast Main Line from London to the North West. It wasn't to be the first mainline electrification. There had been a number of previous ones, notably to Brighton and Portsmouth on the southern region, and from Manchester to Sheffield via the Woodhead Tunnel on the eastern region. The latter had been completed and opened just a year before the modernisation plan was announced, and been trumpeted as the last word in railway technology. In fact, it was an anachronism, having been instituted before the war by the LNER, suspended during the war, and then completed by British Railways. It was the first mainline scheme to utilise overhead wiring and was electrified at 1500 volts DC current. This was the standard laid down by the Ministry of Transport's Pringle and Weir Committee in 1928, which recommended this standard for all future electrification. A number of suburban systems around the country were electrified to this standard between the wars, and it was twice confirmed, latterly by British Railways itself in 1951. When the modernisation plan was announced, 1500 volts DC was proposed for the West Coast Main Line, and initial works were commenced on this basis. The problem with low-voltage DC electrical systems is the requirement to have electricity substations at frequent intervals. The Southern Railway had standardised on 600 volts DC current and needed substations every 4 or 5 miles. This was fine for a system with short runs, but would be a problem on a 400-mile-long railway. The overhead infrastructure for a 1500 volt DC system was also quite heavy. Before the Woodhead scheme was even completed, wiser councils began to question the acceptance of the 1928 recommendations. In the quarter century which followed, a great deal was done to investigate the feasibility of much higher voltages, especially on the continent. As the French rebuilt their railways after the massive damage sustained in the war, they adopted a system of 25,000 volts AC, 25 kilovolts, at 50 cycles per second to match their national electricity supply. Technical advances made this possible, notably in power control, where DC had previously been supreme. This was now the most advanced electrification system in the world, and other countries soon adopted it. As a trial, the former Midland Railway's electrified line from Lancaster to Heysham, itself a trial installation in 1908, energised at 6,600 volts AC, was converted from 25 cycles to 50 cycles, with a view to this being used on the west coast. However, on the 6th of March 1956, the British Transport Commission announced that all forthcoming electrification projects, including the West Coast Main Line, would adopt the same system as the French, 25 kV AC at 50 cycles. Electrifying a railway involves a massive amount of disruption, and the new schemes put forward by the British Transport Commission would take many years to come to fruition. The adoption of the 25 kV AC standard rendered most previous electrification projects obsolete at a stroke. Isolated examples such as the Woodhead route and its associated branches could remain, but where extensions to existing schemes were required, conversion of those existing lines was seen as the most logical way forward. Critics have pointed out that this change to the standard cost the British taxpayer dear at a time when British Railways was already losing money at an alarming rate. But in retrospect it was the correct decision, a rare one for the modernisation plan. One of the first lines to be electrified throughout to the new standard was the London, Tilbury and Southend system from Fenchurch Street in East London to Tilbury and Shoeburyness. In fact, it was electrified with two voltages, 25,000 and 6,250, both AC. This complicated the work and the control equipment in the trains and led to problems with the traction motors, rectifiers and battery chargers. They were overcome at some considerable cost, but it was subsequently decided that the use of the lower voltage was unnecessary after all, and the line and stock were later converted to the single 25 kV standard. One DC scheme to be converted was the former Great Eastern Line from Liverpool Street to Southend. This was already being electrified on the 1500 volt DC system when the modernisation plan was announced. Work continued and it went live in 1956, just as the announcement was being made of the new standards. After just 5 years operation, the line was converted to 25 kV AC, surely one of the most expensive electrification schemes ever. However, the stock was all converted and the rest of the Great Eastern lines to Colchester and Clacton were electrified at the same time to create a unified modern electrified system. Of course, not all the lines from Liverpool Street were electrified. The main line to Ipswich and Norwich was to be dieselised, the first main line to be so treated under the modernisation plan. Mainline trains were worked by English Electric Type 4 locomotives, whilst outer suburban and semi-fast trains were worked by Brush Type 2 machines. They would be serviced at a new dedicated diesel shed at Stratford.
Inside again, let's look at a depot built specially for the maintenance of mainline diesel locos. A massive glass structure with 6 roads and split-level maintenance, which can handle up to 150 trains like this. Gone are the days when men in the sheds only saw a white shirt at weekends.
As previously noted, in 1956 the carefully crafted and planned pilot scheme was hastily abandoned due to a slump and further heavy losses by British Railways. Instead of waiting to evaluate the pilot scheme locomotives, mass orders were placed for further locomotives to these designs and to even newer ones straight off the drawing board. Fortunately, the Brush Type 2s were relatively successful and the 20 pilot orders were increased to 263. Another aspect of railway operations to come within the modernisation plan was that of freight handling. Old-fashioned shunting and marshalling of wagons was labour-intensive and inefficient. The Big Four had invested in large marshalling sidings in selected areas, but the British Transport Commission was to commit a large part of that £1.5 billion to a massive increase in their numbers. In this, the former LNER regions were to receive a large injection of capital. Some of the modernisation plan's biggest blunders would take place in the field of freight wagons and their handling. The first was in connection with the brakes. Most wagons inherited by British Railways had simple hand brakes only. Those which did have automatic brakes were fitted with vacuum-operated ones when the evidence was that air-operated brakes were far more efficient. Hindsight, a wonderful thing, suggests that the opportunity to equip the wagon fleet at this time with air brakes was woefully missed. The Commission decided to standardise on vacuum brakes. The second was the marshalling yards themselves. These were relevant at the time the Commission committed to them. However, their principle was the automation of the handling of the traditional short wheelbase four-wheel wagon. Already that was obsolete, although there were tens of thousands of them still in use. Changes in the patterns of freight movements were already evident in 1955. A great deal of the railway's troubles stemmed from the use of these old-fashioned wagons, but British Railways was still building them to what were, effectively, pre-war designs. The obligation to take any traffic offered as a common carrier was rescinded in 1957 and gave British Railways the opportunity to cease to carry non-paying traffic. Pick-up goods trains should have started to be phased out then and the wagon fleet modernised. The railway could now concentrate on the types of traffic to which it was most suited, long-distance bulk traffic, but its assets weren't yet suitable. The marshalling yards investment programme would create 55 new marshalling yards and see 145 smaller yards close. Many of the new marshalling yards would themselves be redundant within 10 years. These scenes were recorded at the great marshalling yard established at Tinsley on the eastern side of Sheffield. Undoubtedly it made the handling of the wagons more efficient and concentrated the traffic of a very busy area in one place. It was on the cusp of the London, Midland and Eastern region boundaries and served the steel mills and heavy industry of Sheffield and Rotherham. Tinsley was a typical modernisation plan marshalling yard. These were all built to a similar specification, featuring hump shunting and a series of receiving and sorting sidings. Wagons were pushed to the top of the hump, from which they ran down by gravity towards the sorting sidings, their speed being controlled by a series of retarders which, together with the points, were controlled by an operator in the control office. Some, like Tinsley, had a purpose-built diesel locomotive depot built on the site. Construction was spread over a period of about 8 years, so some of them weren't even opened until well into the time when it was realised that British Railways was no longer going to continue to be in the market for which they'd been devised. As with most aspects of the modernisation plans, the newsreels recorded progress.
The plan provides for the concentration of marshalling into fewer highly mechanised centres. In fact, we already have places like Temple Mills here, most modern marshalling yard in Europe, with novel features like what appear to be robot trucks operating themselves. The method is worked by the automatic operation of primary retarders, which ensure that wagons descend from the hump at the optimum speed for safe shunting. Weight and approach speed are first measured by mechanical and electronic equipment, which passes on the information to the retarder mechanism by the time the wagon reaches it. Secondary retarders are operated from the control tower. With the new marshalling yards handling many times the amount of freight they have in the past, new goods sheds with every labour-saving contraption, like this one at Peterborough, are being built.
The southern region's share of the modernisation plan was the much-delayed resumption of electrification. However, notably on the Hastings main line, for which a series of diesel-electric units were built, specially adapted to cater for its restricted or narrow loading gauge, there were variations to the old Southern Railway's plans. A recognition of one of its commercial rivals, air transport, was the construction of a new station on the Brighton main line south of Red Hill to accommodate traffic from the new Gatwick Airport, which is seen in the throes of construction. An airport had existed here since 1930, when a flying club was established. Commercial flights started to Paris in 1936, at which time trains started to call at the old Gatwick Racecourse station, which had existed here since 1891, and the airport was used by the RAF during the war. In 1952 it was selected as the site for London's second airport, to Heathrow, as it tended to have a rather different weather pattern to the principal London airport. Previously, if aircraft had to be diverted from Heathrow due to adverse weather conditions, such as fog, aircraft were diverted to places such as Blackbush or Herne, which tended to share Heathrow's weather. It was also chosen thanks to its proximity to the Brighton main line, which would give it direct access to the centre of London's West End. The project was started in March 1956, when the existing airport was completely closed to allow construction to start. The main terminal buildings were constructed alongside the railway, and a covered way gave direct access to a new station built for the railway. Construction took 2 3/4 years and cost £7.8 million. Airport and station were opened by the Queen on the 9th of June 1958. The major southern project was electrification to the Kent coast, some 20 years after the Southern Railway had proposed it. a documentary recorded the planning processes needed for this.
Over big areas, such as the Kent Coast electrification scheme, aerial camera survey does the work more efficiently and far more quickly than could be done by ground surveyors. The films, taken so as to overlap slightly, make a complete picture of the area covered. From this picture, Southern Region engineers worked out details of plans necessary for the Kent Coast scheme and then submitted them for expert examination by the Southern Area Board, its chief engineers and top executives. One of the earliest parts of the railway modernisation programme, it was urged forward by Sir Philip Water, the board chairman. Wherever required by Chief Operating Superintendent S.A. Fitch and his team, models were made. Though only part of the 15-year plan, the Kent Coast scheme is a tremendous undertaking. The cost will be 45 millions. 250 route miles will be electrified, and the first phase of the scheme, as far as Ramsgate, Dover and Sheerness, will operate by June 1959. By 1962, all lines in Kent will have been electrified, and the Kent Coast Line will not only carry the heavy and always increasing holiday traffic, it'll also improve residential services for people working in London. British Railways Southern Region gives top priority to a £25 million scheme to modernise the lines to the Kent Coast, including the last word in electric and diesel-electric locos, 58 of them in all, to make the service cheaper and cleaner. Electrification's only part of the plan. Traffic's increasing all the time and more tracks are needed to let the fast trains through while the suburban trains make their stops. Sir Philip Water, Chairman, and Mr. C.P. Hopkins, General Manager of Southern Region, inspect progress on the scheme, which is due for completion by June 1959. On the Rainham and Newington section, 100,000 tons of earth have been moved. Newington Station is being rebuilt to allow for 4 tracks instead of 2, and half a dozen other stations are receiving major alterations. The Kent Coast Line carries continental traffic, suburban traffic, holiday traffic, long-distance commuters, and of course freight. With more tracks, fewer curves, colour light signalling, new rolling stock and electric power all the way, Southern Region will soon be bringing London a lot nearer to the sea.
Margate and other northeast Kent resorts are brought nearer to London by the latest in railway modernisation. The Kent Coast Special made the inaugural run from Victoria. VIPs present included Sir Brian Robertson and Sir Philip Water. Here, with the General Manager Southern Area, was the Mayor of Ramsgate. He was among the trainload of guests invited to sample the journey by a new train on the newly electrified line of the Southern Region's Southeastern Division, 4 tracks along most of the way. Buffet cars will be as popular with passengers as with the guests on the first trip. 27 bridges have had to be enlarged or rebuilt. Sir Brian Robertson mingled with the travellers. The Director General, French Railways, complimented him on the train's comfort. 6 days after this run, began the once-an-hour express service, supplemented by several semi-fast trains. To the well-known resorts, it's not only a holiday trade boon, it must also mean that thousands of workers living in London will go down there to live. To the Mayor of Margate, Sir Brian Robertson must see manna from heaven, and so must the Chairman of the Southern Region, Sir Philip Water. 2 top railway executives from Belgium came over to inspect the scheme, so the Mayor welcomed good company to Margate. Soon, thousands of jaded city folk will live in the tonic air of the Kent Coast. Thousands more will pop down for the day. It's so quick, harassed mothers in London will soon be telling their children after tea, go down to Margate and play on the sands till bedtime.
As mentioned in the documentary, the scheme was in 2 phases. The Southern had been exempted from the requirement to use 25 kilovolts AC overhead electrification due to the wide extent of its existing electrification, so the second phase was to extend the third rail to the channel ports via Tunbridge and Ashford. At Folkestone, a new central station was established, and the infamous Folkestone Harbour branch, with its severe gradients necessitating the use of as many as 4 banking engines, was also to be electrified, thus eliminating the problem. Completion of this project would mean that all the major towns and the city of Canterbury would be brought within commuting distance of London, and the famous Sparks effect was to be felt in Kent from the late 1950s onwards. Train running patterns would be completely changed, the introduction of regular and frequent clock-face timetables being the most important change to operating practices. The electrification would also lead to the elimination of many obsolete steam locomotives and the transfer of the more recent examples to the parts of the Southern Region which still required them. Kent Coast scheme completed the electrification of all mainline services within the central and eastern divisions of the southern, which would henceforth be served by the ubiquitous electric multiple units, or EMUs. However, the channel ports still needed special boat trains. The EMUs would provide a regular service thence, but the Golden Arrow and the night ferry services had unique locomotive-hauled stock, the night ferry continuing to be taken aboard a special ferry to give through workings to France. For these services, the Southern ordered a series of 24 electric locomotives built at Doncaster Works. They were a development of 3 electric locomotives produced by the Southern Railway in 1941, and, like them, had booster flywheels to enable them to negotiate gaps in the third rail power supply. It was also intended to use them on freight workings in the electrified area. In order to avoid the danger posed by a third rail installed in shunting yards where there were many staff working, they were fitted with pantographs to pick up electricity from overhead wires in those yards. These were only to give access to the yards, as shunting would be undertaken by diesel shunters. The Golden Arrow service was always seen as a prestige train, and British Railways gave it priority in the early 1950s when 2 of the then new Britannia-class steam locomotives were provided to work it. From 1961 it was placed in the hands of the new electric locomotives. The Pullman coaches for the train were also provided new in the early 1950s, it being one of the Festival of Britain trains, a number of which were equipped with new coaches at the time of that post-war exhibition. The new electrics had a somewhat checkered career. As pure electric locomotives, they suffered from the fact that most freight traffic on the busy Southern electric system was run at night to keep it away from the busy commuter services. Unfortunately, that was also the only time that maintenance could be done, and such work required the switching off of the electricity supply. 24 machines were too many for the work available, which was, in any event, the part of British Railways traffic which was rapidly decreasing. Most of the class was out of use by the mid-1970s, although 10 were withdrawn in the mid-1960s to be converted to electro-diesel operation on the South Western Division. The South Western Division comprised the lines from Waterloo Station. The suburban services had started to be converted to third rail electric operation from the middle of the First World War, and most had been done before the advent of the Second World War. This left the main lines to Southampton and Bournemouth and the west of England still in the hands of steam locomotion. The Southern had plans to electrify both those routes, but its plans were suspended firstly by the advent of war and then the parlous financial situation which followed. No funds were allocated to this potential project in the Modernisation plan, so at the end of the 1950s, steam trains still threaded their way amongst the myriad of electric services on the complex approaches to Waterloo Station. Despite the delays, it can be said that the Southern's overall plan was still being adhered to. The intention was always that the most modern steam locomotives would be moved from a newly electrified area to the remaining non-electrified ones. This now took place once again, as the Kent Coast scheme was completed. The South Western Division received a large number of steam locomotives from the Kent area, which enabled it to dispose of many older classes. All the charismatic Bullied Pacifics, all 140 of them, were now concentrated on the South Western, 90 of them in a modified form which made them the most up-to-date steam locomotives on British Railways. This rebuilding took place from 1956 to 1961, and together with a number of standard steam locomotives provided the South Western with a fleet of steam locomotives, many of which were less than 10 years old. The Bullied Pacifics had been controversial since their inception. The first had been built during the Second World War in response to the delays to the electrification plan. 30 of the original version, the Merchant Navy class, were built, and they handled the prestige expresses such as the Bournemouth Belle Pullman train. After the war, a smaller version, known as the Light Pacifics or West Country and Battle of Britain classes, was introduced, 110 being built. Bullied had incorporated a number of features to try to make the locomotives easier to maintain, but these had merely added complications. In the mid-1950s, British Railways decided to remove the unconventional features and produced a more efficient and totally up-to-date locomotive with a potential 15 to 20-year life ahead of it. So, with no provision for electrifying its southwestern main lines, this left the southern region as the last part of British railways running a modern service entirely with steam traction. Elsewhere, despite mounting losses, there were, at last, the first signs appearing of a new railway. But there were to be even greater problems to be overcome before the railways of Great Britain stopped falling and started to rise once again. But before that happened, there was a final ceremony to be recorded.
Steam engines have been built at Crewe for 115 years, but this is the last they'll ever make. Nowadays, steam's giving way to diesel-electric power. Over 7,300 engines have been built at Crewe, and that's a lot of locomotives. But times are changing, and one day, even this newborn monster will be just a number in a schoolboy's scrapbook, just a stack of steel on the scrap heap.